You know, I've always identified most with Tendi on this show, but I never felt more seen than when Boyler was dreaming about tap dancing with Beverly Crusher.
Great. Watch. Good.
This show gets me so much. Hello interwebs, I hope you are all doing well and welcome to my belated review of the penultimate episode of Star Trek Lower Decks Season 4, this episode titled The Inner Fight, in a clear reference to the classic Next Generation episode, The Inner Light, even though this episode has almost nothing to do with that episode and much more to do with this series' namesake episode of the Next Generation, Lower Decks. But we will get to that in a little bit when I get into my spoiler-filled section of this review, but we will also, as normal, have a spoiler-free section. But first off, I just wish to say to everybody, I am so sorry that this review is belated. I actually meant to say the reason why in last week's review of episode 8, but I completely forgot. And while I did mention the reason in my Loki review for that week, a lot less people watch my Loki reviews than they do my Lower Decks reviews. So I actually got a ton of messages from a bunch of you last week being like, Jessie, are you okay? Like my email literally filled up on Thursday being like, are you all right? I went to look for your Lower Decks review and it wasn't there. Are you fine? Are you dead or something? Like, I was actually very touched that people got concerned and thought I was dead because I missed a Lower Decks review. Like, it makes me feel good to know that if anything bad does happen to me, people will instantly know the second I miss a Star Trek review. It was actually a very kind and good feeling. So to all of you who sent very concerned emails or messages my way, thank you. I appreciate it. But the real reason that this review is belated is not for anything bad, but really great news. And that's because last week I was out filming my movie Identities, my science fiction film that the wonderful streaming service Nebula is funding. And while I cannot talk a lot in detail about the film just yet because of, you know, I'm not allowed to talk about spoilers because Nebula has all these, not rules, but they want to like promote the film in a very specific way. And I'm very pumped and excited for that. So I'm very excited. And I don't want to spoil the film for you either. So you'll hear more as we sort of get to, you know, all of that stuff and we get into post-production. But what I can say is honestly, last week was a dream come true on so many levels. I got to direct such amazing actors and work with such clear artists and like the top level craftspeople in their field, whether it be the amazing actors like John Delancey or Abigail Thorne or Maggie Mae Fish or Jessica Nicole and everyone, Ezra, like James, literally everyone in the cast was amazing, but the crew was also just, I was spoiled. I was spoiled by this crew. Like, everyone was just so good at their jobs, and everyone was telling me, this is not how most sets work, and not everyone is usually this effective. I'm just like, it's probably because we cast mostly queer and trans people to work on the film, and we tend to be on our A game. So I was just, it was an absolute honor to finally make a movie. It's been a dream for a long time, and just to work with so many wonderful people, it meant the world. And I am sore and tired and exhausted right now, but and minorly delirious, but I feel so satisfied, and just looking at some of the footage we have, I'm just so excited to get into post and to actually show this thing to you, because I just want to uplift everyone's work and everyone's wonderful artistry on the film. Anyways, I'll be talking about more about that in the weeks and months to come, but I just had to say why I was late for this review, and also that I'm so excited for all of that. So we'll get to that very shortly. You should be very pumped. But let's actually talk about this episode of Lower Decks, and I'll talk about spoilers in a moment, but staying spoiler free, I'm actually kind of glad that I was belated on this episode specifically, because I get to react a little bit to some of the reactions to this episode from other Trekkies that I saw online after this one came out. And what made me feel really good was I saw a lot of people who have generally even liked Lower Decks, but haven't always seen it as like the same level of other Star Trek series, start to be like, oh, I get what Lower Decks is doing now, because there was such a moment of character building and gravitas that was so overt and very depthful and nuanced in this episode, that people were just like, wow, I never really thought Lower Decks would go there. And I've just been sitting here being like, this is what Lower Decks always was. You know, Lower Decks has always had these like really wonderful fun moments. It's uplifting Star Trek, making fun of it at the same time that it shares joy in it. But it's always been so mature in its character and emotional storytelling and its themes and ideas. Like the nuance in this series has been there right from the the start. And I've been extolling that virtue for so long. And not that people necessarily missed it, but this episode just had such a gut punch of a moment that was just so beautifully built towards and felt so meaningful and just fit the character so well that I think people just ended up starting talking about it in that way, and finally giving Lower Decks the overt praise that it has always deserved, and it has generally gotten, but in some cases some people just didn't see that, and I'm so glad. And this is not me saying I told you so, it's more me saying like I'm just really glad that people are really, I think this moment just finally crystallized for a lot of people what I love about Lower Decks, and I'm so glad that even the people who have been a little bit, not necessarily like not getting it, but a little bit slower to like overtly be able to articulate that, starting to get that, and it just makes me so happy because this team it just killed it and delivered, and this episode is no different. The other things I will say spoiler free here is that this episode built up upon the storyline of the season, and while they didn't go the route that I wanted them to do, or at least I was sort of theorizing, I should say, I didn't really want it either way, it was just my theory. But I will say the ending of this episode and the way that they built into this season-long storyline, I really loved, and I thought was just a really smart, clever, and very like an homage to Star Trek's in a sort of pastiche way, but not very specifically. Like it was still doing its own thing, which is always what I love Lower Decks doing, like evoking other Star Treks, but still being very unique in its own way of telling that story. So I thought all of that was really wonderful. And then finally, and I'll talk more about this in spoilers, but the sort of big moment of this episode, especially with Mariner, just crystallizes everything I love about Star Trek and about Lower Decks specifically. Just this joy and love of trying to connect with others and to grow from our faults into being something better than ourselves because we have an ideal to strive towards that we may never reach, but we always try to better ourselves. And this episode just captures that essence of Star Trek in such a beautiful, amazing way, and then also with a little Lower Decksian twist to it that I just adore. So on every level, this was just a phenomenal episode of Lower Decks, and its ending had me very excited going into the finale next week. But to talk about all of that, let us get into spoilers. Oh, by the way, before we get too far, in case some of you are thinking, "Oh, Jessie, you're kind of going lazy on the cosplay today," just want to let you know this is a full Kirk is a jerk cosplay. So yeah, I go all out just for you. Okay, now that we are in spoilers, I have to start off this being like, Nick Locarno! Oh my god, they brought back Nick Locarno. Robert Duncan McNeil is coming back, not to play Tom Paris like he did, I believe, in season 1 or 2 of Lower Decks, but back playing Nick Locarno, his character from the episode The First Duty on The Next Generation. Is such a wonderful Lower Decksian thing to do. Like, only Lower Decks would do that, and I adored that. My only negative, and it has nothing to do with the show, my only negative about bringing Nick Locarno back with Robert Duncan McNeil is me being like, poor Garrett Wang. If any of you listen to the Delta Flyers, which is Robert Duncan McNeil and Garrett Wang's sort of Star Trek Voyager rewatch podcast, you know Garrett is such a huge Trekkie, and it makes me laugh a little bit that Robert Duncan McNeil, who is expressed even in his podcast being like, I don't really have any desire to return to acting all that much either. He has like appeared twice in Lower Decks as his 2 characters in all of Star Trek, and poor Garrett Wang, our forever ensign and like a true Lower Dexter, in all of Star Trek, has yet to appear. So get on that, Lower Decks. Get Ensign Kim, or hopefully, Grand Admiral Kim. Is that a thing in Star Trek? I'm caught up in Grand Admiral Thrawn nonsense in my own brain from Ahsoka. But yeah, you know what? Make Kim Grand Admiral Kim. I'm here for that. I'm very much here for that. But yeah, just the only quote-unquote negative. I do want to see Kim in Lower Decks if we ever get him in here, because he's a perfect fit for the series. Anyways, let's get on into this episode. We start off the episode with Lower Dexters on a xenobiologist compound with scientists studying like weird aliens on this like off-the-beat planet. Very Star Trekian sort of thing to do. I feel like there's just so many people in Star Trek being like, I'm gonna like specialize in this one specific species on this one specific planet and nothing else that you get to see in the series. And I always love that bit. And that this scientist guy being like, Like, I love them. I'm in academic romance with them, which is such a great term. But then being freaked out when the fence goes down, I thought was wonderful. And Boimler yelling at Mariner's like, at least put on the venom pants, I thought was great. But this goes into Mariner's arc for this season. And I'm going to talk more about Mariner's arc in just a little bit because I've seen some criticism of this arc as a sort of a regression for her character. But for me, it works really well. But I'll talk about that when we get to the sort of climactic moment of the episode for that. But Mariner sort of putting herself in danger and getting the thing done, but also like being reckless in the sense that it gets other people hurt. And yes, it's a very cartoonish way. Like the xenobiologist has his eyes lost. It is playing into the sort of animation aspect of this, because if this happened in live action, I'd be like, Mariner is fucked up and honestly should be reprimanded. Well, here we're giving it a little bit of a pass considering it's animation. We're allowed to heighten the stakes a little bit in a way that doesn't necessarily make it too visceral. But I could see some people being very bothered by that if Mariner had done that in like a live action sense, and even could be bothered by it in an animation sense. For me, I thought it was very funny. But I also get people being freaked out by it. But then we get the lower Dexters being called into Captain Freeman's ready room or meeting room and having a conference about why Mariner is putting herself in danger. I really love this because it's something that Captain Freeman would not have done in earlier seasons. It shows her growth, because in earlier seasons she would have just yelled at Mariner. She would have said, "You're putting yourself in," like she would have just done it. And here she's recognizing who Mariner's friends are, recognizing that something needs to be done, and trying to do it in an empathetic way that is trying to figure out what's best for Mariner in these moments, despite the fact that they have missions going on. So I actually really thought that this was like in a very Captain Freeman way, like I'm going to call a meeting and yell at people sort of way, her being empathetic and showing growth for her treatment of Mariner, which I love those like subtle differences. Like this is not what Freeman would have done in season 1. But then we learned that because of all the stuff going on this season with this mysterious ship stealing crews, they have started targeting specific officers, and we got Beverly Crusher and a few others, and L Carno, who will come back too. But one thing that I wanted to note is that they mentioned Thomas Riker, William Riker's transporter clone, who many of us thought had died in the episode, or just after the episode, Star Trek DS9 Defiant, his last appearance in Star Trek, because he was taken by the Cardassians and probably put in some sort of labor camp or something like that, and eventually, put up against the wall and shot, as, fascists tend to do, like the Cardassian government at the time. But thankfully, he's not dead, so hopefully we'll actually get to see Thomas Riker at some point. I think that would be great. I mean, Jonathan Frakes always seems game to do something for Star Trek at any point, so here's hoping. I would love to see, honestly, at this point, I would much rather see Thomas Riker than Will Riker. I love Will Riker to death, one of my favorite characters in all of Star Trek, but we've seen a lot of them, and Thomas Riker getting a cameo or an appearance in some Star Trek show would be absolutely wonderful. But that being said, we do get the girls trip plus Boimler going out to sort of pretend that they're going on a dangerous mission to protect Mariner, and I love this whole sequence where they sort of get dropped down by the Klingon bird of prey. I thought it was just a fun way to get them onto this planet. The only negative I have here is Boimler is just very quick when the Klingon bird of prey decloaks to say, "You did this, Mariner.
This is your fault. You wished for this."
And I thought, Boimler, that just feels a little bit overheightened. It just, number one, I feel like Boimler in the situation wouldn't be throwing around accusations. He'd be worried about getting things done. And maybe he threw around that accusation, after the fact, when they had gotten on the planet. But here he just sort of like comes into frame and just yells that at Mariner. I'm like, this is not the time for that, Boimler. It's not going to help anybody. And I don't feel like Boimler would have done that. I feel it was just done to sort of like raise the stakes for Mariner being reckless, and it just never even comes back up that Boimler did that. It feels like if Boimler did that, Mariner would have been more upset at him for that in the moment, and it also feels like Boimler wouldn't have done that. It was my one little character moment that didn't read completely well for me this episode, but it's very, very minor in the grand scheme of things. Let's jump over to the new Axton storyline with the main Cerritos crew, just to talk out all of that, because I thought this was great. Cerritos appears above New Axton, which is a very like Mos Eisley-ian kind of Star Warsian planet. And I love that the Cerritos crew is like, oh yeah, they have no rules. This is a backwater planet that does anything. And they're like, no, we have ways of doing things. Like, yes, it's not Starfleet ways of doing things, but like even we have rules. Like we have setups for people to come into the planet. Like you can't just let anything go willy-nilly. People need to land. It'd be absolute, like, imagine if Mos Eisley Spaceport wasn't a spaceport, It's like it's a spaceport because people like come there and know how to dock. It can't be just pandemonium in its place of scum and villainy. So I thought that culture shock for the Cerritos crew was very, very fun. And then obviously we go down to the planet. They get pushed out by the bouncer, which is great. And I'm like, go to Zorky's. I would love to go. Let's get some intel over at Zorky's. Why does no one want to go to Zorky's? I thought that was great. Also on the planet, we get to see in the background a couple times a Gorn walking around, and I was just sitting here being like, are those the same Gorn that do little spit babies in Strange New Worlds? Is that Gorn going around doing little spit baby, little xenomorph babies? Because if so, it's a bit weird. So I just thought it's one of those weird things about Lower Decks being very clearly original series and Next Generation inspired versus like Strange New Worlds. And again, I don't necessarily need like everything to match up one-to-one. Like I'm fine with things evolving, different takes on stuff, even though I have criticisms of the Gorn in Strange New Worlds, but it was just one of those like, just weird to see the dichotomy in the same year of just Gorn differences in Star Trek. So yeah, that was just an interesting little background bit. But my favorite bit of this entire sequence was when they go up into the bar and they meet the kind of alien that looked like the alien from the Corbinite maneuver. That was definitely a puppet in that episode because the First Federation was using it to sort of fake their like test or whatever. It's been a minute since I watched the episode, but I always remember that puppet that like ended every episode in the original series in the credit sequence. And I just love its movements like just moving like this, and Captain Freeman thinking it's puppet and then grabbing it and shaking. I'm like, oh my god, it was so horrible and yet so funny. I nearly died. It was great. Again, I could see people being upset by like Freeman whacking a poor guy thinking it was a puppet, especially since we learn at the end of the episode that she knew that it was real because she was playing it up. So I could get down with that, but for me, this was hilarious. But then we ultimately learn that it was indeed Billups under that mask of that bounty hunter, that very, Star Warsian-esque bounty hunter mask that we saw going around, and that this is all played by Freeman to get the information that she needed because she knew no one would trust Starfleet. It reminded me of the episode Gambit from The Next Generation, very underappreciated two-parter from The Next Generation, especially its final season, which, is mid-season at best. But those episodes I actually thought were really good, and sort of Riker sort of having to earn the trust of the pirate crew because he was a Starfleet member. So I thought that was like a nice, like, again, homage to an episode like that without being overt about it, which I really kind of enjoyed. This brings us back over, though, to the planet that the Lower Deckers land on, minus Rutherford, and like, everything here was great. I love seeing the Vasquez rocks in the background. We get to start to see the actual crew of the different alien ships that have been sort of stolen throughout this entire season on this planet, including Ma'ak, who is our Klingon friend all the way back from Ouija Dude, so it was nice to finally see. I was so glad that he was alive, because when I saw him supposedly die in the season premiere, I was really upset because I really liked his character being like a Boimler-esque Klingon. So I was like kind of sad to see him have been sort of killed off almost unceremoniously. So I'm glad that he's alive here and gets such a great moment to do stuff with. But then we sort of get to like see different crews working together, like the Romulans and the Ferengi, trying to take down a common enemy with the Klingon, which is evoking something we'll get to later on the episode, that these different alien species can work together. You just need to give them a shared goal and sort of inspire them. So I loved all of that. But then, Mariner is constantly putting himself in danger, was about to take down the Cardassian that attacks them. But T'Lyn takes it out and says, I was like, some of the snark from T'Lyn is like, no doubt you would have tried. I'm like, T'Lyn being a snarky Vulcan. I'm here for the Vulcan sass. Like we all know from the original series with Spock, like Vulcan sass is the best sass. So I'm here for it. Then we sort of get them in the cave, another cave, by the way, if anyone hadn't noticed, with them sort of saying like, we can't go out because there's too many storms, but we can get to this satellite and sort of send out a message. But then Mariner sneaking out in the middle of the night to go do so without anyone else helping her. She doesn't want to endanger her friends. And the moment where she steps over Boimler, he goes, oh, tap dance with me, Beverly Crusher. I nearly, the animation on Boimler's face at that moment is what sold it to me. Like that little like face while he's sleeping. I nearly died.
Teach me how to tap dance, Beverly Crusher.
I will say I did watch this episode last week while I was filming. Not during the middle of filming, but like at the end of the day, we had 12-hour shoot days, so I would come back to the Airbnb I rented and like collapse on a bed and watch a show for like 30 minutes and go to sleep. And I did watch this episode of Lower Decks then, and me and one of the crew members who I was sharing an Airbnb with, we like nearly just like cackled cackled. We had to like pause the episode and like roll over. We may have been mildly like dehydrated and delirious because of the amount of work we had been doing that week. But that specific moment just nearly killed us both. You would have been like, Jessie, you could like see in the newspaper, YouTuber Jessie Gender dies doing what she loves, laughing at Lower Decks, and making a film. So it was just a fun little moment. Anyways, we do have Mariner run into Ma'ak, and they sort of get into a fight, and then they stop because it was too dangerous outside. Which and Ma'ak being very much like, well, this is not a proper time for combat. We will wait until there's more room. And I'm like, that's totally what an honorable Klingon would do. And like be like, we will fight in the exact right, proper, honorary way. And Mariner respecting that in her own weird way, despite her being like angry and ready to go. And Ma'ak sort of seeing that as her warrior spirit, and seeing that she, despite her own sort of stuff going on with her right now, she is actually an honorable person. And I like that, him noticing that. But then this brings us to the emotional climax of this episode, and what I loved this episode for, specifically with Mariner. In that we get the reveal of why Mariner has been acting out throughout the entire series, and even more specifically these past few episodes this season. And she brings up a few things, the first of which is that her friend, Sito, died for Starfleet during a Cardassian mission. And this is a reference to the character of Sito from the episode The First Duty, where Nick L Carno first appeared in, one of the best episodes of the original series. Next Generation, I should say. And then also appeared in the namesake episode of Star Trek Lower Decks on the Next Generation, and who died in that episode in one of the most tragic episodes of the entire series. And I loved this. I saw some criticism, shout out to my lovely friend Sean Farrick over at Trek Culture, who said that this moment he thought was a little bit too fan servicey, essentially, that it dates Mariner in a certain way, it's just like we didn't need her. I actually would disagree. I get the argument that this is fan servicey, that like we're name dropping Sito in order to have another overt connection in the Next Generation, especially since we're dealing with Nick L Carno this episode. But for me, I think it works in a bunch of different ways. Number one, it does tie this series directly into the original episode of Lower Decks, not just in name, but it actually finally plot-wise tying that in. I thought that was a fun way to do it. And also, I think it speaks to, again, what I talked about in the spoiler-free section, in that Lower Decks is a very emotionally mature show. You can tell, like, while it's making fun of stuff and doing a bunch of different things, trying to be comedic Star Trek, you can always tell that there's so much detail and thought put into the world building and the emotions of the characters throughout this series. And to tie that into one of Lower Decks, in Star Trek The Next Generation's Lower Decks, most emotionally affecting moments, I thought just was a great sort of like closing the loop sort of thing on that idea of Lower Decks for me, and to do it in a way that affects Mariner and shows that she believes in Starfleet. She believes in what Starfleet does, and she thinks Starfleet itself fails at times. Doing that and seeing the trauma that it has passed on to her because of what she'd had to do in Starfleet through things like the Dominion War, and what it does to some of the officers. I mean, I even think of the episode where Troy in the Next Generation learns that to be a leader, you have to let people die. And
that's what this was all about, wasn't it? To see if I'd order someone to their death.
That's right.
I knew that was part of being in command, and I thought I'd prepared for it.
Mariner not wanting to be that person who has to make those choices and just wants to be a Lower Dexter so she doesn't have to have that responsibility, and could push it all out. I think that's just such a wonderful, it does what Lower Decks I think does really well, which is love Star Trek, but also critique it in a really fun way. And honestly, for me, this episode I think is the real best first time that we've seen Star Trek, in any sense, deal with the trauma and PTSD of the Dominion War. Deep Space Nine, when it did the Dominion War, kind of wrapped it up very quickly, and while Voyager kind of touched upon it in bits and spurts with the sort of Maquis being dead storyline towards the end of its series, we never really got a sense of, like, what Starfleet changed in the interim between like what we see, in Deep Space Nine and where we are in Picard, where it's a much more hawkish sort of federation due to events with the Romulans and the Synths. And even Picard Season 3 kind of dealt with some of the ramifications of Dominion War, but for me, I have a lot of problems with that. See my review of Picard Season 3. And so for me, this really felt like it was the first time that Star Trek has really dealt with a personal level trauma of post-traumatic stress disorder for people like all of Starfleet after the Dominion War, and what the Starfleet of the Dominion War was versus what Starfleet was supposed to be, because it had to be that more militaristic Starfleet because of the Dominion War, and what that put upon Mariner, her hopes and dreams for Starfleet and what she had to become, and then funneling that through the reference of Sito, I thought was so great. And I also saw people saying like, oh, this was Mariner regressing as a character. You know, she thought she would have grown past this after seasons like 2 or 3 with her character arc. But for me, I think it makes perfect sense for her. You know, we saw back in season 1, she was promoted. She instantly like shoved that down and got like busted back down to engine. She tried really hard. And this season, we've seen her get like that getting promoted is clearly a trigger for Mariner. And then for her to be given radical support by Ransom this entire season, something that she's never really had. And because of that, her like having to like reject even harder to sort of like, she's not really processing that trauma that she's gone through in any overt way, and just have like whatever she's had a chance to like start to process it when she's promoted, she instantly rejects it and pushes away. And now she can't do that. Her normal tactics aren't working because of Ransom's beautiful, wonderful support. And so because of that, you know, she's just getting worse and worse and worse because she's not emotionally processing, because she doesn't go to therapy with Miglimo. And so for me, I think this makes perfect sense given the situation she is in this season, having been promoted and being supported by Ransom. I could see other people saying this is a regression for a character, and I think it is a regression, but in a way that makes sense for her. It worked perfectly for me. And also the fact that, you know, Lower Decks did this all in kind of like a monologue. There was no like flashback to Mariner fighting in the Dominion War or whatever, and then no like crystallizing moment. Like it was all done just in a monologue with Mariner. Showcases that this series is, you know, animated, could do anything it wants, but it knows when it needs to stay with its characters and focus on them and give them moments to breathe instead of just doing a bunch of action stuff. Again, it's why I love Lower Decks on every single level. From there, though, we get Mach sort of inspiring Mariner, and I love Mach doing that because he is a Klingon version of Boimler, as we saw in Ouija Dooge, and it speaks to the evocation of, you know, what Boimler and Mariner give to each other in their relationship. Like, this is what Mariner needs out of her relationship with the people like Boimler. And to that fact, eventually when Mariner sort of hugs Mach and they become friends, and Mach's like, no, we're not allies, no! Them leading to going to the satellite and trying to convince all of the different disparate Starfleet, different Star Trek aliens there to work together. We have Tendi jumping in and saying to like the Orions there being, no, you need to listen to her, and calling Mariner essentially her family. Which speaks to what I was just talking about, you know? I loved that moment, but the moment for me that especially landed was just Mariner inspiring everybody to work together. You know, the different aliens working, you know, together to fight back against something. And believing that we could create this coalition of disparate groups. Like, that's so Star Trekian, and for Mariner to say that, especially at this point in her arc, was so beautiful. It's why I love Lower Decks. It's why I love Star Trek. These ideas of just, you know, being able to work with each other across differences, across disagreements. Like, across cultures, Lower Decks gets it. Lower Decks gets Star Trek. Lower Decks gets what's beautiful about humanity. And I just love this show for that. But then they sort of, you know, go and fight the Klingon bird of prey. They jump on top of it. It reminded me very much of like Star Trek Beyond, one of my favorite Star Trek movies, in a very similar sense. They break in and they get control of it. But at the last minute, Mariner is taken away by, we discover, Nick L Carno, who is apparently our big bad of the season, ending on a to be continued. And I've already spoken a bunch about Nick L Carno, and I'm just like, such a Lower Decksian choice to go with. Love it, adore it. Very pumped for next episode. So this was another great episode of Lower Decks. Not that they rarely aren't that. So yeah, I think this is fantastic, and very pumped to go into the finale, which by the time this episode review goes up will probably be tomorrow. So looking forward to that, and until then, my friends, I hope you all live long and prosper.